Act 1, Embers in the Snow. Welcome. Let me take you back to a winter many have forgotten. A time when a nation was not yet born, but already bleeding. When courage had no uniform, and defiance lived in the silence between footfalls. It is December, 1776. The war for American independence has begun, but it has not yet become inevitable. The colonies are fractured. The future uncertain. The sky above New Jersey is gray, heavy with snow, and the air carries the smell of wood smoke and worry. The British hold New York. Washington's army has retreated across the Delaware River. Many say the cause is lost, that the dream of liberty has frozen in the mud of a bitter winter. But scattered across the land, hidden in forests, barns, and prayer, burn quiet embers. Not enough to be seen from the towers of power, but enough to keep something alive. This is the story of one of those embers. A brief encounter, a single road, and a young man who would ride it, never to return. They called it the ambush of Geary. Aye, between empire and rebellion. To understand what happened on that road outside Lockdown, we must first understand the ground beneath it. New Jersey in 1776 was a divided land, caught between loyalty and revolution, between British regulars and patriot militias. Its people lived not at the edge of war, but in the middle of it. Farms became outposts. Taverns became intelligence posts. Churches held whispered prayers and hidden powder kegs alike. In towns like Amwell and Pennington, life went on, but never untouched. A knock at the door might bring a request for bread, or a demand for your sons. No one could afford to speak too freely, not even to family. The British called these people rebels. The patriots called themselves citizens. But most were simply trying to survive. 2. The captain and the carpenter. Captain John Schenck was not a professional soldier. He was a carpenter by trade, a farmer by necessity, and a leader by the will of his neighbors. In his early 40s, he wore the lines of labor around his eyes. His hands were calloused, his coat threadbare. But his voice was steady. His men followed him not for money or glory, but because he was one of them. He had no command tent, no rank beyond what the militia voted him. But he had something rarer, trust. And so, when rumors reached Amwell of British patrols riding unguarded through the countryside, it was Schenck they turned to. The reports were vague. A cavalry officer. 5 or 6 men. Riding east to west between Pennington and Pittstown. Always around dusk. Always the same stretch of road. A pattern. And in war, patterns are invitations. A pattern. And in war, patterns are invitations. 3. A rider from another world. Cornet Francis Geary was 22 years old. The son of Admiral Sir Francis Geary of the British Navy. Educated, well-bred, confident. He had grown up with maps on the wall and strategy at the dinner table. He came to America not to conquer, but to restore order, to bring the colonies back under the crown, as a dutiful son of the empire. Assigned to the 16th Queen's Light Dragoons, he rode well, dressed sharply, and wrote letters home in polished script. In one, he described the American countryside as rough but beautiful, and the rebels as poorly organized but passionate. He had not seen much combat. His duties were mostly patrol and reconnaissance. But the risk was always there. Roads could turn deadly. A musket could crack from the woods at any moment. Still, he rode. On December 14, 1776, he would mount his horse as he always had, uniform pressed, saber at his side, journal in his satchel. He would not return. 4. The Weaver's Son. Down in Flemington, a boy named Elias Hobb helped his mother gather kindling outside the weaving shed. 13 years old. Tall for his age, but still uncertain. His father had died the winter before from fever. His older brother had joined the militia with Schenck. Elias was left to tend the fire and keep the goats fed. That morning, he saw 3 men on horseback pass by the creek at sunrise. Redcoats. They didn't look his way. But he remembered their faces. Not the expressions, but how pale they looked in the cold. Elias ran to the church and told the pastor. Who told the baker? Who told the blacksmith? By sunset, word had reached the militia in Amwell. The British were moving again. The Black Bell Ringer. In the town of Ringgoes, a man known only as Jonah rang the church bell every Sabbath. No one knew if he had been born free or bought his freedom. He rarely spoke. But he listened. And when he heard talk of an ambush, he walked down the hill to a barn just outside town where a woman named Anna Worth hung laundry in the snow. They're planning something, Jonah said. Anna nodded. They have to. He looked at her. Be careful what's said around the boy, he said, nodding toward her son. He listens too much. Anna gave a thin smile. Don't we all? 6. An empire stretched thin. The British Empire in 1776 was formidable, but far from invincible. It had stretched itself across the Atlantic, fighting rebels in the Americas, unrest in Ireland, and threats from France and Spain. Supplies moved slowly. Horses died in the cold. Loyalist support was strong in the cities, but thin in the forests and fields. Light dragoons like Geary were tasked with bridging this gap, patrolling between outposts, gathering intelligence, delivering messages. But they were also vulnerable. Far from supply lines. Exposed. Cornet Geary's patrol was such a group, 6 men moving between garrisons. He had done the route many times before. He likely expected little trouble. History would disagree. 7. A map and a prayer. In a dim room above a cooper's shop, Captain Schenk spread a map on the table. A crude drawing of local roads, hills, and trees. We wait here, he said, pointing. Near the bend at Lockdown. They'll come from the east. We fire once, scattering to the woods. No drawn-out fight. Just shock. Confusion. Disruption. His men nodded. No one spoke of glory. Only of timing, and cover, and powder. Outside, snow began to fall again, softly, silently, as if to blanket what would come. 8. A letter never sent. Somewhere in his belongings, Cornet Geary had a half-finished letter, addressed to his sister. Speaking of the countryside, of the cold, of the strange silence, in the New Jersey woods. He would never finish it. After his death, the letter would be found, folded and blood-stained. His sister, reading it months later, would wonder what he had seen in those final moments, what silence had spoken to him before the shots rang out. 9. The hunters in the pines. At dawn, Schenk and his 8 men left Amwell. They moved through the trees like ghosts. No fire. No horses. Each carried a musket, powder, and little else. Among them was Thomas Bell, a schoolteacher who had closed his classroom to take up arms, and Caleb Moss, who had buried his youngest child 2 weeks before. They said little. War did not require speeches. They reached the ambush site by midday, dug shallow foxholes, laid pine branches over them, waited, and waited. A long silence. Time slows in the snow. Minutes stretch. Joints ache. Thoughts wander. As the sun began to set, the militia lay still beneath their camouflage. A squirrel darted across the road. Somewhere, a branch snapped. Then nothing. And then hooves. End of Act 1. Act 2, the road to Lockdown. The road was quiet. A thin layer of snow softened every step. Trees on either side bent slightly under the weight of ice, as if leaning in to listen. Captain Schenk lay still behind a fallen log. His breath came in slow clouds. Around him, the others waited, hidden beneath pine branches and brush. The militia was not trained for this. But they knew the land. They knew patience. They knew silence. And on this day, silence was the strongest weapon they had. Distant hooves. The first sound was faint. Hooves. 6 horses, no more. The measured rhythm of trained cavalry, confident, not cautious. Cornet Francis Geary rode at the front. His cloak billowed slightly, deep navy against the pale trees. His saber hung at his side, the steel catching glimpses of the dying sun. Behind him, 5 men. Riders of the 16th Queen's Light Dragoons. Faces red from cold, voices low from fatigue. They spoke only in short phrases, observations of smoke in the distance, fence lines, wagon tracks. None of them noticed the stillness in the trees. None of them saw the glint of a musket barrel beneath the brush. 2. Fire in the pines. Schenk gave no command. There was no need. Each man knew when to fire, when the riders were close enough, when the road narrowed, when the moment came. It came quickly. The first shot split the air like lightning. A horse screamed. A rider tumbled. Then 5 more shots, cracking almost at once. Chaos. Geary's horse reared. He shouted something, an order maybe, or a name, but it was swallowed by the shouts of the wounded, the blast of another musket, the thudding of hooves fleeing in panic. One dragoon was already down, bleeding into the snow. Another lay stunned beside his mount. The rest turned and galloped back the way they'd come, disappearing into the trees. Geary did not. He tried to turn. His horse staggered. A shot struck him, not fatally, not yet, but hard enough to tear him from the saddle. He hit the road hard, saber still in hand. 3. The last stand. What happened next lives in fragments, reconstructed from letters, journals, hearsay. Some say Geary tried to rise, that he pulled himself behind a tree and returned fire with a pistol. Others claim he stood, dazed, staring into the woods until a second shot took him. One account says Schenk himself fired that final shot. Another says it was Thomas Bell, the schoolteacher, weeping as he aimed. What's known is this: Geary was struck twice. Once in the shoulder. Once in the chest. He died in the snow, clutching the hilt of his saber. The militia did not approach. They waited. Watched. When the road was clear, they vanished into the woods. By the time British reinforcements arrived hours later, the only sound was wind in the trees. 4. The Hessian who followed. In the days following the ambush, a Hessian soldier, a mercenary hired by the British, visited the site. His name was Hans Richter. He was in his 30s, far from home, and tired of war. He had no love for the rebels, but neither did he hate them. He had fought in Saxony and Silesia and thought this American war strange, too quiet, too personal. He walked the bend in the road, stood over the spot where Geary had fallen, and lit a pipe. "Not war," he said in German. "This is something else." Letters across the sea. When news of Geary's death reached England, it arrived not in official dispatches, but in whispers. Sir Francis Geary, his father, received word by courier, not from the Crown, but from a former naval officer who had heard it through a loyalist merchant. He sat in his drawing room, the fireplace cracking, a map of the American colonies on the table beside him. He read the letter twice. Then again. There was no detail. No explanation. Only that his son had died in New Jersey, cut down in a rebel ambush. Later, he would receive Geary's effects, his saber, a half-finished letter, and a bloody journal. He never spoke of it publicly. But his youngest daughter recalled waking one night to find him sitting in the hallway, staring at the journal's cover. He said nothing. Just sat there, turning it over in his hands. 6. The widow's bread. In a farmhouse a few miles from the ambush site, a woman named Ruth Whitman baked bread by candlelight. Her husband had been conscripted by loyalist forces. Her son had joined the local militia. She remained alone, feeding both sides when they came through. That night, she saw the glow of torches in the distance. British search parties. She took 2 loaves of bread, wrapped them in cloth, and stepped out into the snow. They did not thank her. They didn't need to. One soldier took the bread. Another asked, "Did you see who fired?" She said no. They didn't press. As they left, she whispered, "He's buried not far." In case you come back with shovels. She never told anyone why she said it. 7. The General's silence. In a stone house across the Delaware, General George Washington sat before a modest fire, reviewing intelligence reports. The ambush was noted in one line of a larger dispatch. Cornet Geary killed near Lockdown. Rebel militia involved. British cavalry disturbed. He read it twice. Marked it. Then moved on. To Washington, every small act of resistance was both a tactical victory and a moral obligation. He would never mention Geary's name in correspondence. Not because it was unimportant, but because the war allowed little time for mourning the enemy. Still, that night, he wrote in his journal, "The land speaks in quiet action. May Providence favor our cause." 8. The watchmaker of Pennington. Nathaniel Cross was a watchmaker. Too old for war, too proud for silence. He kept to his shop, but his ears were open. In the days after the ambush, British officers passed through Pennington, asking questions, demanding names. Nathaniel offered nothing. But he remembered Geary. Had once seen the young officer buying ink at the general store. He had noticed how clean his boots were, how calm his eyes seemed. Later, Cross would write in his own diary, "It is a curious thing to hate an army, yet pity a man." 9. The empty saddle. One of the horses returned. A chestnut mare, trembling, saddle torn, reins dragging. She wandered into a barn near Flemington 3 days after the ambush. The farmer who found her recognized the saddle's markings, 16th Dragoons. He fed her, brushed the frost from her mane, and tethered her near the hay. He told no one. Weeks later, he released her into the woods. "She's seen enough of men," he told his wife. Memory in the snow. The ambush of Cornet Geary would never make the grand histories. It was too small. Too local. No lines were redrawn. No treaty signed. No famous last words. And yet, to the people of Hunterdon County, it mattered. It was proof that resistance lived beyond the formal battlefield. That even in the bitter cold of December, even in a valley watched by redcoats, the spirit of rebellion could still spark and strike. Children in Lockdown would grow up hearing stories of the ghost horse, of the man who fell with saber in hand, of the pine boughs that shivered without wind. Some would call it a victory, others a tragedy. Most would forget it entirely. But for those who were there, those who lay in the brush, who baked the bread, who watched from behind shutters, it would never be just a skirmish. It was a moment when the war came home. End of Act 2. Act 3. Echoes and Consequences. Snow fell the day after the ambush. Not in great drifts, but in a thin, silent veil that blurred the trees and softened the scars on the road. The blood had frozen into the dirt. The footprints had been swept by wind. Only the birds remembered the sound of muskets. And even they had grown quiet. The war went on. But something had changed here, in this hollow bend in the road between Flemington and Lockdown. Something invisible, but heavy. A sense that history had passed through, paused, and left a mark too subtle for the maps. The British knew the name of the dead. The Americans knew the weight of what they'd done. The land knew both. The Reverend's letter. The Reverend Ezra Brigham served a mixed parish. Some of his flock were loyalists. Some were patriots. Most kept their opinions as close as their coin purses. A week after the ambush, he delivered a sermon on mercy. He spoke of wounds that do not bleed, and forgiveness that does not forget. That evening, he wrote to his cousin in New Haven. "A British officer was killed in our woods. A lad no older than my own Daniel. The rebels call it a victory. The Crown calls it murder. I call it sorrow. I prayed over the ground, but found no peace. Only silence." 2. The runaway. His name was Matthew. No last name. He had fled a loyalist estate the year before, and lived hidden near the river, among trees and shadows. He did not know who Cornet Geary was. But he saw the ambush from a ridge. He saw the young officer fall. He saw the rebels scatter. He waited until darkness before approaching the place. There, he found a brass button, torn from a coat. He carried it in his pocket for years, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Freedom, he would later say, is not always clean. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it buries one. In time, Matthew would join a black regiment. He would fight at Yorktown. He would never again see Locktown, but the button stayed with him until the day he died. 3. Redcoats in the mist. The British returned to the ambush site days later. They came with torches and shovels. Geary's body had been buried hastily by locals, more out of respect than allegiance. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Dalrymple, ordered the ground disturbed. The coffin, made of pine boards, was lifted and carried back toward Pennington. Geary was reinterred near the Anglican church. A small wooden cross marked the grave. Dalrymple later wrote, "He was too young for this war. And yet, if youth is no protection, neither is rank." In that same report, he requested retaliatory action. He did not know how, or where, or upon whom. Only that something must be done. Nothing ever was. 4. The widow who watched. Elizabeth Yates lived half a mile from the bend in the road. She was a war widow, her husband killed at Kip's Bay. Her loyalty was to no flag. She kept her head down and her doors locked. But she saw the whole thing. She told no one for years. Not even her sister. Only in her final days did she speak of it. They were boys. All of them. Boys dressed as men, killing other boys. I prayed. I wept. I stayed behind the curtain. She died in 1792, having told her story only once. The intelligence officer. Captain Alan Wickham worked in ink and silence. British intelligence was not yet what it would become. But men like Wickham moved quietly across colonies, listening, writing, vanishing. He came to Hunterdon County weeks after Geary's death. He interviewed no one. He simply walked the road, made sketches, and filled a slim leather-bound book. In one of the margins he wrote, "The locals know. But they won't speak. Not out of fear. But pride. This land has teeth." That book would disappear into archives. It would not be read again for more than a century. 6. George Washington again. The wars shifted in the weeks that followed. Trenton. Princeton. A string of unlikely American successes. Washington never referenced Geary or Locktown again. But the militia from Hunterdon County? He remembered them. He would later write, "There is power in the man who does not flee. Even more in the one who does not boast." When the war ended, and peace was signed, many of those men returned to their fields. Few asked for reward. Fewer still received one. But they had tasted what it meant to fight back, and win. 7. The schoolteacher's ledger. In a cupboard in a stone house outside Ringo's, there sits an old ledger. It belonged to Thomas Bell, the schoolteacher who fired one of the first shots that day. After the war, he returned to teaching. Arithmetic, mostly. And a bit of Latin. But on the back page of that ledger, written in faded ink, is this: "I saw him fall. He looked surprised. Not angry. Not afraid. Just surprised. I think he believed we wouldn't do it. That no one would. That's what ended him. Not the bullet. The disbelief." Bell never told anyone he had been there. But he marked the date, every year, with a walk down that same road. Until his legs gave out. 8. The legend grows. Stories began to change. In some tellings, Geary was a monster, an arrogant tyrant with a saber dripping in blood. In others, he was a tragic figure, a decent man killed by cowards. Still others turned the tale toward prophecy, that his ghost rode the road each winter, looking for a fight that would never come. Children dared each other to walk the bend alone at dusk. Old men swore they saw hoofprints appear in fresh snow. The war became a memory. The memory became a story. The story became a myth. And somewhere beneath it all, a young man had died, far from home. 1799. 23 years after the ambush, a monument was proposed. A simple stone to mark the place. Not to honor either side, but to remind. The plan never came to be. Funds were short. Tempers ran hot. Some felt the war was best left buried. But a few still remembered. An old farmer named Reuben, who had been a boy at the time, planted a tree near the bend. A white oak. He told no one why. The final reflection. We return now to the beginning. To a frozen road. To a young officer named Francis Geary. To the men who lay in wait. To the people who watched from their windows, their woods, their prayers. The Revolutionary War was made of moments like these. Not just the declarations, the battles, the treaties, but the forgotten places. The splinters in the floorboards. The button in a pocket. The horse that never came home. Freedom is not always declared with a flourish. Sometimes it is whispered, carved into frost, etched into silence. The ambush of Geary will not make the great paintings. It will not be recited in the rotundas. But it is a part of that long, cold breath that became America. And perhaps that is enough. End of Act 3.